Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Eberline, and I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum located outside of Washington, D.C. Thank you so very much for joining us this afternoon for this very special Brave Girls Virtual Storytime of She Loved Baseball, the Effa Manley Story. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended a Brave Girls program before, welcome back. We thank you for taking time out of your Wednesday to be with us this afternoon. As always, we are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. Audrey will be answering questions at the end of her reading, so if you or your little one would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You may ask a question at any time during the presentation, but we won't be answering those until the end of the reading. Effa always loved baseball. As a young woman, she would go to Yankee Stadium just to see Babe Ruth's mighty swing, but she never dreamed she would someday own a baseball team or be the first and only woman ever inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. From her childhood in Philadelphia to her groundbreaking role as business manager and owner of the Newark Eagles, Manley always fought for what was right, and she always swung for the fences. Here to share Effa's story is author Audrey Vernick. Audrey grew up in Whitestone, New York, where she lived with her parents and two sisters and a not very bright small white dog. She always loved to read and still rereads Harriet the Spy on a regular basis. She was not one of those children who always knew she wanted to be a writer. She didn't love to write until college, but she's been writing ever since. In addition to writing for children, Audrey has published more than a dozen short stories for adults in magazines and literary journals. She received an MFA from Sarah Lawrence College, and she divides her time between writing, which is mostly spent revising, and visiting elementary schools to talk about writing and publishing. She also speaks at conferences around the country, and she lives near the ocean in New Jersey with her family and one fairly intelligent, medium-sized black dog. It is my very great pleasure to have her with us for today's Brave Girls Virtual Storytime presentation. Please welcome Audrey Vernick. Audrey?
Thanks so much. I'm going to just tell you one thing before I start reading, because it's going to be someone's question. So you can think of another question now while I'm reading. I am someone who, I feel like I know a lot about baseball, but 15 years ago, my son came home with this. It's a Time for Kids. And the cover story was about Hurricane Katrina, but there was an article inside, this little purple one here, that had the headline, Baseball's First Lady. And it was about this person, Effa Manley, who I'd never heard of. And what was even crazier was she was important to New Jersey history too. And I live in New Jersey and I still hadn't heard of her. So that's how I came to know her story. And I never thought I'd write nonfiction, because when I was a young reader, nonfiction was not well written. I mean, it was boring. It was always like, this important person did this important thing on this important day, yay! And it just never held my interest. So I never thought I'd write nonfiction because it didn't interest me. But I felt like I had to write up the story, because the more I learned about her, the more I felt like everyone should know this story. So I'm going to get started doing that, and I will probably lead you to more questions. But here we go. This is She Loved Baseball, the Effa Manley Story. Oh, I should have said, and the illustrations are by Don Tate, who is really quite an illustrator. When she was in first grade, Effa Brooks was called to the principal's office. Young lady, the principal said, her voice hard and mean. Why must you play with those Negroes in the schoolyard? That's a word they used then that we don't really use anymore, but that is what the principal said, so that's why I chose to use the word there. Those Negroes were Effa's brothers and sisters. While Effa's skin was light, like her mother's, like her mother's, her siblings were dark, like their father. People with dark skin couldn't eat in certain restaurants or swim in public pools. Now it seemed they couldn't play with their sister either. That's just the way things are, people said, but it never made sense to Effa. As Effa grew up in Philadelphia in the early 1900s, America grew up too. Bold new music, jazz, blared, and folks stepped out in strange new shoes called sneakers. After high school, Effa moved to New York City, which seems like the perfect place to live the big life she dreamed of. Everyone was talking about Babe Ruth, the Yankees' new slugging sensation. Effa went to games just to see his mighty swing. Nothing prepared her for the crackling energy of the 1932 World Series at Yankee Stadium. New York was beating the Chicago Cubs, and the crowd roared its approval. In that swirl of excitement, Effa met a kind, fun-loving man, Abe Manley. Abe adored baseball. He soon adored Effa, too. He would take Effa out on the town in Harlem, a bustling Black neighborhood in New York City. But something in Harlem really bothered Effa. Even in Black communities, most businesses were owned by white people, and Black people were not hired for most jobs. Well, that's just the way things are, people said. But Effa knew it wasn't right. She organized the Citizens League for Fair Play, a group of community leaders. They urged Harlem's largest department store to hire Black sales clerks. The owner said no. Nobody believed a group of Black people could change a white businessman's mind, but the League fought anyway. For weeks, they marched in the street, carrying signs that said, "Don't buy where you can't work." They convinced their neighbors to shop elsewhere. The store lost money, but still, no Black sales clerks. The League kept marching. Finally, they won. Newspapers reported the boycott's success. Effa proudly placed the articles in her scrapbook. Before long, hundreds of Black people were working in stores throughout Harlem. The world of baseball was headed for change too. Abe and Effa married in 1935 and started a team, the Brooklyn Eagles, in the new National Negro League that Abe helped establish. Abe took the team south for spring training, but there was much to do in Brooklyn, organizing schedules, ordering equipment, arranging transportation. Effa had never done work like that before, but she enjoyed it. By the time the Eagles moved to New Jersey in 1936, Effa was handling almost all the team's business. The city of Newark welcomed the Eagles. There was nothing more thrilling than a ball game at Rupert Field. The hot, sweet, and salty summer smells, the crack of the bat, people in their finest clothes standing, a few at first, willing the ball to keep going, then everyone at once, the thunderous cheer, the roar echoing blocks away. When first baseman Mule Suttles came to bat, the crowd chanted, "Kick, Mule," hoping to see his high-stepping home run swing. Monty Irvin had one of the most magnificent arms that's ever been in baseball, Effa said. He was also an amazing shortstop. Irwin and power-hitting second baseman Larry Doby were one of the best double play combinations ever. Then there was Leon Day. He played every place on the field except catcher. I don't mean he filled in, he played them, Effa said. In broiling summer heat, Day would pitch the first game of a doubleheader, then trot out to play outfield for the second. When Effa attended team league meetings, other owners protested. Baseball's no place for a woman. But over time, they came to respect her because she understood business and she understood baseball. Many owners only wanted to make money from their teams, but Effa cared about hers. She bought the best uniforms and a fancy, comfortable bus. She encouraged players to be active in the community and found them off-season jobs playing ball in Puerto Rico. Her players called her their mother hen. The Eagles had talent and skill, but for years they were only second best. There was no beating the Kansas City Monarchs. In 1946, they got their chance. It all came down to one final Negro League World Series game. The best view was from the press box, but Effa sat in the stands where the seats vibrated from foot-stomping excitement. Newark had a one-run lead going into the final inning. With 2 outs, the Monarchs had 2 men on base. Effa couldn't watch. She heard the crushing thwack of bat hitting ball and waited one awful second. Was it? Say it wasn't. A home run? The Newark crowd was cheering. Effa peeked through her fingers. The first baseman had made the catch. The Eagles were world champions. It was Effa's proudest moment. The next year, Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, the first Black player in the major leagues. So many people, not just baseball fans, were proud and hopeful about change and equality in America. Many Black Americans became Dodger fans that year. Unfortunately, this meant the Negro Leagues lost fans and also started losing their best players without even getting paid for them. Some major league owners didn't know Negro League players had contracts. Others didn't care. When Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, signed Don Newcombe in 1945, the Eagles lost an important player and received nothing in return. Effa was glad to see her players get their big break, but she believed all teams, not just white ones, should be paid for their players. She talked to the press and made people think about how unfair it was, instead of saying, that's just the way things are. Some began to ask, but why? So when Cleveland Indians owner Bill Veeck became interested in Larry Doby, he was ready to negotiate. In July 1947, he paid the Eagles $15,000, and Doby became the first Black player in the American League. Effa was losing another great player, but she wished him well. She told him, Doby, keep hitting the ball out of the park. He did. After that, the Major League team owners always paid Negro League teams for their players, but more and more players left, and soon Negro League ball came to an end. In 1952, Abe became ill and died. Effa lost her best friend, business partner, and truest love all at once. She often looked at her scrapbook to remind her of good times. As she browsed those pages, something kept nagging at her. The history of the Negro Leagues was slipping away. That's just the way things are, people said, but it broke Effa's heart. In the 1970s, she began a letter writing campaign to convince the National Baseball Hall of Fame to acknowledge the best Negro League players. The Hall had honored some who had also played in the majors, such as Jackie Robinson in 1962, but none who had played their entire career in the Negro Leagues. When the Hall appointed a committee to consider honoring Negro League stars, Effa was thrilled. Between 1971 and 1977, the committee voted to induct 9 Negro League players, including former Eagle star Monty Irvin. Then it announced it had completed its work. Effa was outraged. She could name dozens more who deserved the honor, especially 2 Eagles, slugger Mule Suttles and Biz Mackey, who had managed the 1946 championship team. She continued writing to the Hall until she died in 1981. The Hall wasn't finished with Negro League players after all. Over the years, more of Effa's favorites were inducted, but many, including Suttles and Mackey, were not. It wasn't right. It was just the way things were until 2006. On July 30th, Suttles and Mackey and 10 other Negro League players were finally inducted into the Hall of Fame. Effa would have been so proud. Something else happened that day, something amazing. Effa was inducted along with them. In baseball's long history, Effa Manley was the first woman ever to be so honored, and the only one still, by the way. She was recognized for all she did for her players, for her civil rights work, and for getting the major leagues to treat Negro League teams with respect. On Effa's gravestone, it says, she loved baseball. In 2006, baseball proved it loved her back. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. What an inspiring story. Just a reminder to our audience, we've had a few questions come in, but if you do have a question for Audrey about her life as an author or the book itself, please type those into the Q&A. We have had a few questions come in, but I want to start with just asking you about this book and this story. I know you mentioned in the very beginning that your son had brought home something and you saw her name, but what inspired you to write this particular story? I know that you wrote this a while ago, but what was it?
Oh, I remember very, very palpably how I also thought that once people heard her name, that every writer in America was going to be writing her story, and I had to be the first. I had to be the first for kids. Yeah. So I did feel like a sense of rushing, but I didn't know what I was doing. What I knew is when you're doing research, you go to the library and you take out a book, and that's where you start. And there was one book that I could get my hands on, but it really let me down in one regard. Everything I could find about her, the Baseball Hall of Fame has a research library, and they provided me with clippings as well. But everything you could find said she was born in Philadelphia, and when she was 18, she moved to New York, and there was nothing on her childhood. And as a child, I was much more interested in people if I could meet them when they were a kid than if I was just told about an adult who accomplished certain things. So I felt it was imperative, and I couldn't find anything. And her husband had passed away. She didn't have any children. I couldn't reach any relatives. But the Hall of Fame proved so helpful in two regards. One, I wanted to use primary sources, and there wasn't much to get my hands on, but the Hall of Fame, she left her scrapbook, which is mentioned in this book, to the Hall of Fame. And at the time, if you went to the research library, they had you put on the white gloves and you could look through the scrapbook, and it was really something. And they also eventually unearthed an interview that had been done with her, but not yet transcribed. And they let me listen to it. She sounded like my grandma. So that really affected me. And in that interview, she gave that interesting, sad thing that I opened the book with, where the principal yells at her for playing with her brothers and sisters. So I'm sort of sideways answering your question, but the real answer is, the more I heard about her, she would hear about things that like were impossible and then make them happen, and like repeatedly, like, you know, the way she fought Harlem, the way she was a woman in business then, what, you know, and baseball's such a man's business. So it wasn't just business, it was the manliest business of all businesses. And Manley, that's her name. So that's crazy. But she just, her like just matter of fact way of like, well, this is wrong, so we're not going to allow this to be. And the way she would find a way around it just really inspired me. And I thought it would have to inspire other people too.
So I mentioned before all of our guests joined us that we do sometimes have classes that come in. So we have Miss Erickson's class, and Samantha from Miss Erickson's class wants to know, what inspires you to be an author? So inspired inspires you to be an author?
I have two answers that come close to answering this. I feel like there's like, if I'd need like maybe 6 hours to answer that in its entirety, but I can cover maybe 98% of it with two things. As a young reader, I practically ate my books. Like I loved my books. And if I loved a book, I read it and reread it and reread it. So there is this attachment I have to words that came when I was really young. But the truth is, I think you mentioned it in the introduction, I didn't always know I'd be a writer. Like I liked math too, you know, like in elementary school, everything sort of was like, yeah, that's good, that's good. And then when I got to college, that's a point where you get to decide what classes you want to take instead of having to take what they tell you to take. And my writing classes were the ones I liked the most and the ones I did the best in. And I give a lot of credit to my professors, because to me, writing was something you did for a class, or it was something you did in a journal at home, though I wasn't a big journaler. And my professors were the ones who said, it's time, like it's time for you to start sending out your work. And honestly, I don't know that I'd have ever thought of it if someone didn't tell me that.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the illustrations. The illustrations are absolutely beautiful. Can you talk a little bit? This is something I like to ask to all of the authors about the process working with an illustrator, and how closely you work together to kind of bring your vision to life, to your words in that.
Well, you have to forget about your vision entirely as a picture book author. I mean, I love absolutely everything Don did, but like, your vision has no place in the book. Your vision is relegated to text. It was interesting because there were questions we couldn't answer. And so we'd have to find workarounds. Like there's that picture where Larry Doby's hitting the home run, and he's like, okay, so what did his uniform look like? And what was his number? And we were like, oh no. And I even tracked down Larry Doby's son, but he didn't know either. You know, like there's some answers you can't get. And so Don Tate, the illustrator, had done another baseball book before this. I think the first book he illustrated was about Willie Mays. And like, he's not a baseball guy. So like you sort of had to go over everything for baseball. And I had my brother-in-law look through this book right before it went to press. And he said, oh, wasn't he like, I think it was about Larry Doby again. He's like, wasn't he a lefty? And the photo was him hitting the home run the opposite way. And baseball people jump on things like that. So that would have been
Absolutely.
a very big mistake to have in the book. And so, you know, it was sort of all hands on deck, like everybody looking in. And but you know, like how did he come up with a picture of what she looked like as a little girl? Like that works for me. That looks like a little girl, but it also looks like Effa Manley. And I just feel like my answer to that is, well, they do magic. They do some
Mhm.
certain kind of art magic. And, you know, Don would bring me his questions and I would answer them when I could, but sometimes I couldn't.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it was great to have a resource at the Hall of Fame. Effa Manley was kind of new to them, you know, new, she had just been inducted. So, or was about to be maybe when I started my research. So she was kind of a little center for them right then. So they could give me what they had.
Yeah. That leads me into a next question. And Cora from Miss Erickson's class is wondering how long the writing process took. I know you said you didn't know a lot about Effa and you had to do a lot of research. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, plus the writing of the story. How long was this process for you?
It was measured in years, in large part because I was not brought up as a writer. I learned fiction. I didn't learn how to write nonfiction. I learned in the way that we all learn in elementary school and high school, how to write a paper and stuff, but I didn't know how to do this. And it's still, whenever I look at this book, I think about how many days Effa Manley lived, how something happened every single day, and how the things I chose are the things that are in this book that made my head explode as a writer. It just felt like the most enormous responsibility I could imagine. And whenever I look at the cover, I think of the one scene we had to cut because of pages. You can only get so many pages. There's giant pictures in the text, you know, alongside the text, and it can't all fit. And so I think it's important for young readers to know, like, everything in this book is true. Everything that I said happened, did, but not everything that's true is in this book, because that's an impossibility. And that's why, as the researcher and the writer, you sort of have to read everything, because when you're reading a book, you are reading the choices that author made about what were the most important things. And that's why I would need to read another book too, to make sure, you know, we're covering all the areas. But it did take years. There was a ton of revision. It was not a simple sale. It took a really long time, but it was my first big publishing book, so it was a very exciting book to sell.
What was, out of curiosity, what was the scene that you had to cut?
For asking. So, you know, Branch Rickey is this icon in American history for the way he, you know, brought Jackie Robinson into the major leagues. But when seen from the point of view of the Negro leagues, he wasn't all that great. You know, he took their players and he didn't pay for them. He was doing something that felt very wrong to the people who own teams in the Negro leagues. So there was a scene in which they were in, Effa and Branch Rickey were in the same ballpark, and she went over to him and she spoke to him very close to his face, and her finger was right there with her. And every report you could read about it reported a different color red that Branch Rickey's face had turned as she was walking away. And I loved her courage in that moment to, like, take on this person who America sees as, look at what this man's doing for us all. And which isn't to discount what he did, but it wasn't all good. It wasn't all good for all the people.
Right. So we've actually had a few questions about this. And how many books, knowing how long this process was with this book, how many books have you written?
Well, how many I've written and how many I've published are like widely different numbers, because not every book you write gets published, though I'd love to change that. But I think I have 25 books out now. Of those, I think only 4 or 5 are nonfiction. I write sort of funny picture books for littler kids and middle grade novels as well.
Great. And here's a question. I like this question very much. Were girls allowed to play baseball then, when Effa was at this time period?
Mostly no. And even when I was a girl, mostly no. But when Effa was a girl, I did write another book that I would have cleverly placed next to me, but didn't, called The Kid from Diamond Street. That's about a team in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Bobbies, which was an all women's team a little before Effa's time even, that played, because there were no other women's teams, they played men's teams, because what else could you do? And that is like pretty much the other opportunity I know about for women to play ball. It was not a lot to choose from back then.
And we also, I mean, in the 1940s, there was the All-American Girls Baseball League as well. So during the time during World War II, there was a women's baseball league. So women were playing baseball kind of at that time, but really opportunities, like you said, were not very front and center. So girls were playing baseball. They just weren't playing baseball like the men were playing baseball professionally, correct? Yeah. So this is, I have to read this comment. I think this is lovely. So this is from one of our attendees. It says, "Thank you for this story. I was not ready to become emotional at the end. I'm so happy that you wrote this history about Effa. I so want to share this book with my 10-year-old grandson. Persistence leads to positive change. What are you working on next?"
That was really nice. Actually, I'm working on something that it's not a sportswoman, it is a woman. And I don't want to say, because it's the same feeling I had with Effa, that as soon as it's out there, everyone's going to be writing about her. And knowing that not every book sells, I just feel like I need to do my research on that in private. But I'm also, my phone decided to make some noises. I'm also, I have a friend I write with. I have a friend, Liz Garten-Scanlon, who I write some of my funny picture books with, and we're at work on some things. And I'm also working on a chapter book about a fluffy shark.
Oh, nice.
You know, a fluffy shark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very nice. So one of the questions that just popped up in the chat. So we've talked a little bit about the research process and you writing the whole thing and how long that all takes, but how long is the editing process for
Well, this was an odd one because I had to, and you know what, this is like a story that it's a little long, but I'm going to share it because to me, it tells you everything about publishing. I had two editors. I knew both of them and I knew they were both baseball fans. And so I had them included in the people that have been submitted to. And in the end, they both said, "We really like this story." They were both at two different New York City publishing houses. And they said, "Would Audrey be willing to revise before we try to acquire this book?" And of course I was, I was a newish author at the time and I still do that. So of course I would. They both pretty much wanted the same kinds of changes. And so they were both willing. They were like, you couldn't do this without both publishers knowing that you're dealing with two, but they all agreed to it in advance. And so I felt like this is my chance. This is it. I have to do the best revision ever. They wanted so much more stuff in it, but not more words, so that's a challenge. And it did have that Branch Rickey scene in it at this point. And I sent it to both my agent sent it to both publishers. And we waited. And the first one that came back was from the one who didn't end up publishing it. And I can tell you verbatim what she said. What she said was, "Wow, it's really kind of a mess, isn't it?" The same exact book went to acquisitions at HarperCollins, and they said, "Wow, she really hit it out of the park." Wow. The same exact thing, looking for the same thing, one, the other. And that's why when someone doesn't like my book, I try not to take it personally. There's no accounting for taste. My favorite movie isn't the same as yours, most likely. We all have our own taste. And it was quite a lesson. But let me tell you, I lived with the, "Wow, it's really kind of a mess" for a long time before the other thing happened. So there was a lot of, "Wow, I blew my chance. I just turned it into this big stinking mess." So the editing, we had a hard time on this one because there was just so much we wanted to include, and there's really only so much you can include. This book, I think more than any of my other picture books, was just begging for more, and which is interesting because there was nothing from her childhood except that one scene. So it really was all adulthood stuff, but it just all felt important. And I'm friendly with the editor still, and she was a very easy person to work with, and she completely understood why it was hard, what I loved about her was what she loved about her. And we got there, but I don't remember how long, but it was not quick. It was not a quick editing. There was a lot of back and forth on this one. We'd be so proud if we cut 12 words one day, because it just had to just keep shrinking.
Do you have a favorite part of this book or the story, whether it made it into the book or it had to be cut for space or anything? Is there a favorite part of that you have?
Not really, but I will tell you, this is my favorite thing I own, which is the original art from one of the scenes.
Wow. Yeah.
And I keep it in my office, but I took it off the wall to show you guys. I chose this one. He let me choose whichever one I wanted. I think there was one he said, I got to keep this one. And I chose this one because I'm a Yankee fan and those are the Yankees on the field. And so I got Effa and the Yankees all in one picture. So, and it needs dusting is something I now know too. But is there something I love the most? No. You know, I love this. I love that there's surprises. Like there's so many weird things. Like I didn't have a particular interest in Negro League baseball, and yet in my house I had a picture of the Monarch, the team they play, the one they finally beat in the World Series. I had that picture just sort of like sitting in my house. My next book that comes out is about Larry Doby, who's the one who's mentioned in here a couple of times. So I like that I circled back to him, and I felt like Larry Doby was a lost opportunity because someone beat me to the punch. That's what I'm always scared of. But it turned out theirs was sort of a fictionalized version and there was no straight out biography. So that comes out in January. I'm excited that Effa, you know, she's sort of back in there and he's back. I like when things circle back on themselves.
Absolutely. And can you give any advice? So we have another teacher coming in asking if you can give any advice to her second and third grade students who are watching about writing or specifically writing books.
I was just talking about this with my daughter, who's an education and writing major. We were talking about how important revision is, but how real revision in those grades is really hard. It's just, it's sort of something like, I want to plant the seed that as you get older, this is going to be a very important part of writing. When I look at the books I've written, I think about like the amount of time I spent on different phases, and probably 15 to 20% is getting down a first draft, and 80 to 85% is revising it. And I think that's really hard to do when you're in second and third grade. I think, you know, you're not going to go through a dozen drafts the way a professional author does, but it's important to open your mind to the fact that you will. That as you get older and if you decide you want to be a writer, that's something that's going to be just what you do. It's not the excitement of getting a new story down, which is exciting, but it's that's a small part of the writing process. The other thing is sort of something alluded to in that story I gave you about how one editor loved it and one didn't. The hardest part for me about writing has always been, well, it's not anymore, but for the longest time, it was hearing when people didn't love what I wrote. Because when you hand something to someone and you say, what do you think? You only want to hear one thing. You're not really asking for an honest opinion. You're hoping they'll say, oh man, this is so good. Yeah. And they don't always say that. And, you know, I went to graduate school for writing, so people would hand me in writing the nasty things they had to say about the things I'd written. And that could make a person shut down and not want to write anymore. And what it does, though, is it prepares you for getting to a point where you can look at that and say, I don't agree with that comment, but that's kind of helpful and I want to look into that. And it's just it's a hard part of like hardening your skin a tiny bit, but it's also not trying to not feel it in your deepest soul when someone has something less than wonderful to say about your writing, especially if you don't agree with it, especially if you feel like, no, I'm going to keep working on this.
Yeah, wonderful. So unfortunately, I can't get to all of the questions that have come in today, but I do want to ask a final question. Knowing Effa and knowing how determined she was to really be the first woman to kind of own a baseball team and to run this baseball team, especially in the time period that she was doing it, what would you say in this writing process, advice that you give to us in Effa's, knowing how Effa was and how courageous she was, what would you leave us with, as we go away? What's the takeaway from this book that you want us to walk away with?
That is such a nice question. That sense of like, well, yeah, that's how things are, and how 99% of us are like, yep, that's how things are, and then having the courage to question that, to challenge it, and to not just in a theoretic way. I mean, she went out and made change happen, and getting Harlem to hire people. I mean, that was after how many decades of them only having white sales clerks in their store, and just marching into baseball meetings, the only woman ever to do so at that point. like, I think she would, like, that's nonsense. You know, she had no patience for the nonsense of the world, and we could all use a little of that. You know, there's plenty of nonsense in the world, and seeing it with a fresh eye isn't always something we do. But, you know, to keep your eyes open, calling out the things that feel wrong, even if they're established, I think that that's right where we are in society. And I do wonder what she'd make of it. You know, she'd be out there. I know that much. She would be out there with people with signs.
Well, thank you again so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us today and sharing Effa's story with us. Just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded. It will be available on our website sometime this week. So if you'd like to go back and rewatch the reading, or if somebody that you know is not able to be with us today, it will be up on the website in the next few days. If you enjoyed today's program, please join us in the coming weeks for more Brave Girls Virtual Storytime readings. On Wednesday, May 12th, author Diane Adams will be with us to read her book, Love Is. And on May 26th, illustrator Elisa Paganelli and author Suzanne Slade will be with us to read their book, June Almeida, Virus Detective. Both events are at noon Eastern Time and are free to attend. Advanced registration for all NWHM programs is required. More details and registration information can be found on womenshistory.org. But I want to thank you again, Audrey, very much for being with us. We so enjoyed the story and hearing about Effa, and we hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we hope to see you all again very, very soon. So thank you.